if we have enough people on now. Fantastic. Okay, our numbers are growing. Great. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yewande Abiose. I'm the Managing Director of the Energy Institute Nigeria branch. I would like to warmly welcome you to another edition of the Energy Dialogue series. This session is organized by the Energy Institute in partnership with Faculty for Oil and Gas Sector Transformation, FOSTA. For the benefit of those new to the Institute, the Energy Institute is the professional membership body bringing together global energy practice. What does this mean? We gather and share essential knowledge about energy. We also help energy professionals further develop their skills in a changing energy landscape. We have 20,000 members across 120 countries. We help articulate their collective voice and use it to advance good practice and standards in the industry. So if you're yet to be a member, I would like to invite you to join our network today. Today's Energy Dialogue is themed Impact of Fiscal Policy on Investment in the Petroleum Sector. Our speakers will discuss the competitiveness of the current oil and gas fiscal regime and its implication for investments, government, and long-term sustainability in the industry. So just a quick note on how today's session will go. The speakers will speak for 5 minutes each on their topic and also explain to us their thoughts on this particular theme. Afterwards, we'll move on to the Q&A segment. So please note down your questions in the box below. We'll answer as many questions as we can. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Mr. Joe Nwakwe. Mr. Joe is the lead partner at Zira Advisory and Consulting with over 30 years oil and gas industry experience. He also has experience with a major oil and gas company where he worked in different segments from well engineering to field and production operations. He also served as a special advisor, policy and regulation for the Nigerian former Honorable Minister of State, Petroleum Resources. He has also authored several papers in different areas of the industry. He'll be bringing his wealth of knowledge to us today, and he will discuss on these topics with our fantastic speakers we have lined up for you today. So without much ado, I would like to bring on board Mr. Joe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yewande. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to join in this discourse to look at our fiscal arrangement, basically the current fiscal arrangement, to see how it compares with that from peer nations across the globe, and to hopefully make recommendations on what we expect going forward our fiscal arrangement will be, that will be able to attract the required level of investment into the sector. So just to give a little bit of background, the PIB, which started 19 years plus ago, was intended to basically consolidate our fiscal laws, not just fiscal, the entire industry laws anyway, but key there is the fiscal arrangement. Remember that our fiscal system has evolved with time. We started out with the royalty tax system, and then we went into the PAC type arrangement. So there's been a lot of, if you will, evolution with time. And some of these were not particularly in alignment with each other. So the understanding all the while, there was need to harmonize, basically look at the two systems and bring up a simpler, less complicated fiscal arrangement, and of course, competitive enough to be able to attract investors into the patch. So that's the background, that's where we started. And we've been doing this for 19 years, we haven't yet landed it. What's the implication? Just the time it has taken us has introduced significant uncertainties, fiscal uncertainty in themselves. So people are basically in a wait and see mode. Investors are saying, well, these guys are changing their laws, so we might as well just wait until we know what it is we're dealing with. So that in itself is a problem. And we've seen it in the numbers. If you look at investment levels in the sector, it hasn't grown. 7, 8 years ago, we were at 2.5 million barrels a day. We are down to less than 2, or about 2, and it's not growing. So if you look at the production numbers, they do not show that we are growing our volumes. If you look at the number of rigs, new finds, which other metric you want to look at, it just shows that the investments are not coming in. So that's the background. That's where we are today. However, this country has about 40 million barrels of oil in the ground. This country has about 200 TCF of gas proven, and we think that's very, very pessimistic. It could be much, much higher than that. So the question really today is, what fiscal arrangements should we put in place to enable the development of this very useful resource before it becomes obsolete? So those are the questions that industry practitioners are asking today. What should we do as a nation to ensure that we monetize these resources that we know we have today, and equally find new ones? It should not be, for those who understand the terrain, the 40 billion in place really is not the whole picture. Our numbers could be maybe 100, could be a lot more than that. If you look at the exploration activities in the last 10 years, it has equally been declining. So that tells you the story. So investment levels are not growing. They are indeed tailing off. So we need to then think of what fiscal arrangements will enable that to happen, will enable the attraction of the investment community to the patch. So that's kind of the background I needed to lay today. So I have a very high-powered set of panelists. So I'm just going to go through quickly so that we don't waste your time. Today, speaking to us, we're going to have 2 lectures. The first person to speak to us today will be Dr. Carol Nackley, and the next will be Professor Wumi Iledare. So I'm just going to give a very quick background. Carol is the founder and CEO of Crystal Energy UK. She's a recognized international authority on global energy issues, in particular, the fields of oil and gas, market development, policy, governance, regulation, fiscal regimes, and contractual arrangements. Carol has worked with oil and gas companies, ENI and Statoil at the executive level, governments and policy organizations, including the academia. And she currently lectures at the Blavatnik School of Governance at Oxford, University of Surrey, and the European University Institute. So Carol will be the very first speaker. So at this point, I think I will invite Dr. Carol to please take control and share her thoughts with us on what should we be doing to make sure that our fiscal arrangement does not just enable the attraction of much needed capital in the sector, but equally form the basis for sustained growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Before I go through my presentation, I think we have a poll question that I would like to ask the participants, or do we wait for the presentation to be finished?
We're going to do it after your presentation.
Okay, that's fine. So if we can go back, please, to my presentation. What I want to focus on is really addressing what the main question that Joe asked, and which is really the topic of this seminar, of this webinar actually, and looking at Nigeria's oil investment climate under existing market conditions. I thought that, but for every fiscal regime, or if you look studying the investment climate in any country, it's not enough to look at what's happening within the country solely, but also to put it in a broader context. And that's what I thought, it would be good to have, first of all, an overview of oil markets and see what the implications for Nigeria of what these drastic changes in external conditions, and then look at some specific recommendations to improving the investment climate in the country. Now, what we have today is a crisis like no other, to quote the IMF. So 2020 is going to be a year that we're going to remember for decades to come. Because of COVID-19, we had a massive collapse in economic growth. And as you can see from this figure, the economic forecasts, which were in April, and you can see the IMF estimates in April, so they worsened over time. So you can see how the IMF in June worsened its forecast for the rest of the year from 3% in April to -5% in for the whole of the year. And also the World Bank and the OECD gave worse figures. And mind you, all these international organizations, they warn that all these figures are highly uncertain and they can go worse if the pandemic does not come under control. And you can see that all around the world, we're seeing some reemergence in the rate of infections, despite some countries saying that they overcame the first wave. Now, this crisis, the collapse in economic activity, had drastic implications on oil market because it hit the oil industry right in its core sector, that is the transport sector. Can we go to the next slide, please? And you can see here, we witnessed an unprecedented collapse in oil demand. Really, I mean, in the past, whenever oil demand would fall by maximum 1 million barrels a day, we'd call it a crisis. But here we're talking about 8 to 9 million barrels a day loss in volumes in oil demand compared to previous year. And this is because people stopped traveling, people stopped driving, and the economy entered into a coma. So as a result, that translated into a weak oil demand. And as a result, we saw the collapse in prices. Next slide, please. So here you can see how prices collapsed in April. Not only that, for the first time in the modern history of the oil industry, the one oil price, WTI, went negative in April. And in May, we saw a recovery in prices. So April, if you want, was the bottom or the worst months for this year for the industry. But since May, we kind of entered we are in stuck. The market is stuck because oil prices are hovering around $40 a barrel, and they don't seem to be going too far from that point, despite the massive production cuts that we saw voluntary from OPEC Plus, including countries such as Nigeria and outside the organization in private production, such as the US. Next slide, please. Now, of course, the collapse in prices had drastic economic implications on major oil exporters around the world. But of course, not all oil exporters are in the same basket because some have better diversified economies than elsewhere. Nigeria, unfortunately, is one of those countries which is poorly diversified, economically speaking, which means that they rely heavily on oil and gas revenues. And as a result, you can see here from this figure that they need an oil price of almost $130 a barrel to balance the budget, whereas oil prices today are 40, and in May they were around $30 a barrel. So there's a lot of acute pain happening in many oil producing and exporting countries, particularly countries such as Nigeria. Next slide, please. And to make things worse, of course, it's not just governments which are suffering, but investment is also suffering in the oil and gas industry. And we saw massive slashing of capital expenditures and also operating expenditures, with companies all around the world cutting down on their investment and throughout the supply chain. So it's not just upstream and downstream. And this has major implications on future supplies. So investment loss today might result in less supplies or production in the future. Next slide, please. Now, all these, if I put them together, you can see that I tilted the balance. There's a list of factors that can shape the government decision when it comes to their fiscal regime and regulations and legislation related to this sector. I wrote a paper recently with a colleague of mine, and it's going to be out soon. I'll be happy to share it with you for those who are interested. We looked at the drivers that can affect fiscal changes, and we put them on the scale. And actually today, where you see that the fall in oil prices, the fall in investment, the fall in production in many places, the fall in exploration activity, you name it, are actually tilting the balance towards pushing host governments to revisit their fiscal terms in a way that makes it more attractive for investment. Whereas usually when you have an increase in prices or an increase in investment activity and spending, and there's a confidence mood in the market, you find that the balance tilts towards tightening the fiscal terms because the bargaining power shifts more towards governments. But today, because capital is so scarce and governments are desperate to attract capital, we're going to see an increase and toughening of the competition for global capital, for investment to be encouraged, and that will drive, it's already driving some governments to revisit their fiscal terms. So what does this mean? All this mean to Nigeria? Next slide, please. Joe, in his opening remark, our chairman today, highlighted the decline, the kind of plateauing in Nigeria's crude oil production in the previous years, and then decline. And at the same time, if you look also at the slide, the reserves growth is not being achieved anymore. We're seeing also a decline in reserves growth. This doesn't mean that Nigeria is running out of oil and gas. On the contrary, Nigeria is sitting on massive potential, particularly deep water and ultra deep water. But the key is to unlock that potential. And I think one, if not the only tool at the moment that governments have in their hand is the fiscal regime. But there's one important point to highlight. Next slide, please. Is that even when prices were healthier than what we had today, if you look at the policy perception index, how investors rank Nigeria, you can see that Nigeria did not do well in terms of the perception from investment perspective, even when prices were high. And I would imagine that under existing conditions, if nothing else changes, this perception is not going to get any better. Now, if I were to give my recommendations on any fiscal regime, next slide, please. I go back to the basics. I look at the guiding principles, what makes a fiscal regime attractive. And there are several principles. Chief among them is stability, so stability of the fiscal regime. And mind you, stability does not mean the fiscal regime is cast in stone, because you need to allow some flexibility every now and then. But there is a difference between occasional modification of the fiscal regime to adjust to changes in conditions, such as, for example, the province goes from a growth phase to a decline phase. And you know, there's a difference between this occasional tinkering and the continuous tinkering that creates a lot of instability and therefore negatively affect the investment confidence in the fiscal regime and in the government policy. The other important feature is simplicity of the regime. You know, you don't need to complicate the fiscal regime to make it robust and well-functioning. I've seen many fiscal regimes which are quite simple yet quite robust. So there is no need to build up all the various instruments, complicate your life and the administration, and add on to the bureaucracy just to think that because you think that you will end up building an ideal fiscal regime. On the contrary, an ideal fiscal regime is one which is simple. And there is the element of progressivity. Progressivity simply means that the government take increases as profitability increases, and the opposite is true, which means the government take decreases as profitability decreases. And there is the final element, which is neutrality, in a sense that the neutral tax should not distort investment decision. So taking these very basic principles, if we look at the Nigerian fiscal regime, we find that it does not do well on any of these principles. So please, can we go to the next slide? You can see here that I identified several weaknesses. And of course, we don't have time to go through all of them, but just highlight a couple of weaknesses. And based on that, I had the recommendations, and we can discuss later in the Q&A for further details. But you can see first important element, which is instability. I mean, if I try to trace the fiscal changes either proposed or implemented in the last few years in Nigeria, in the last 10 years, for instance, I kind of lost track because there were many changes debated, recommended, implemented, then revised, etc. And I have the feeling that all these changes have been pursued partly because the regime does not adjust automatically to changes in different conditions. And in this respect, when you run the numbers, you can see that the fiscal regime in Nigeria lacks progressivity. And particularly because of the heavy reliance on royalty and its high rates. And you add on top of that other regressive instruments such as bonuses, and if you have a production sharing contract, the cost recovery ceiling, among others. Now, of course, the governments try to make the regime more progressive by linking the royalty rate to different variables, and they use a sliding scale, for example, to vary the royalty rate with production, with the water depth, with the oil price or gas price. But in my opinion, this does not introduce progressivity to the fiscal regime, because none of these variables I just mentioned is a good proxy of profitability. And besides, if you try to link a fiscal term to the oil price, you'll end up having a lot of volatility. So it's the opposite of stability. And that's where we recommended if you were to introduce a sliding scale, or you want to link royalty to an important variable, link it to profitability. Then there is the other structural weaknesses, that the unnecessarily complex fiscal regime. I don't understand why you need to have all these instruments, all these variations, and therefore a starting point would be to simplify the regime, because you can achieve the same outcome, even better outcome, with a simple fiscal regime. And then finally, the issue of high royalty rates, which are among the highest in the world. Now I can see from the fiscal changes that were introduced in the DOI PSA last year, it significantly simplifies the structure. However, it kind of adds additional burden on deep water projects, which tend to be costlier than shallow water. So that's something to bear in mind. Next slide, please. Then additional observations, because I came across some statements, especially, for example, with the production sharing contracts. We have to be careful not to look at one instrument in isolation. For example, if you combine royalty with cost recovery ceiling, it's like you're having double royalty because the two instruments achieve the same outcome. So you have to be careful. And this takes me to another point, because I read somewhere, some officials, some experts in Nigeria comparing, for example, the system in Nigeria to the system of Angola, saying that the cost recovery ceiling in Angola is much lower than what Nigeria offers. That is true, but Angola does not impose a royalty, unlike what you have in Nigeria. So these are things to bear in mind when we are making international comparison, not to single out one fiscal instrument or one rate and then compare it with elsewhere. It's like the whole cocktail, the whole package of the fiscal regime that we need to compare and take into consideration when looking at what other countries are doing. And one last point on this, for the fiscal regime and the additional observations, is the issue of investment allowances and credits. Of course, they have been reformed, they have been simplified, because at the beginning, if you look at what happened when they were in place, they did not lead to additional investment. And in my opinion, one of the most powerful investment incentive you could offer is a rapid payback. So to shorten the payback period, or a quick recovery of capital expenditures, among others. So this takes me to my concluding remarks. And again, we can discuss as much as you want all these points. And what I saw in the last 2 years in Nigeria made me believe and conclude that Nigeria is on the right path in terms of moving with the long-awaited reforms of its petroleum fiscal regime, instead of just debating them and creating uncertainties and further delays, because that has negatively affected the investment climate. However, any new fiscal changes should take into consideration not only the immediate government needs to raise revenue, and I can understand the huge need for government to raise revenues today because of the collapse in oil prices, because of the lack of economic diversification, but we have to take into consideration what is happening in global oil markets and what is happening in other competing provinces. Because remember, the competition for international capital is going to get tougher, not easier. And then finally, the fiscal regime, really, it's about establishing a delicate act between achieving government needs and also monetizing on the remaining potential of oil and gas resources, particularly deep water. Because remember, today we're not in the same situation as we were maybe 10 or 20 years ago, because instead of talking about peak oil supply, people are talking increasingly about peak oil demand. And with the world fight against climate change, then the opportunities for the very long term for these assets to be developed gets smaller and smaller. So this is where I would say it's a really delicate act to achieve a balance between short-term needs and longer-term trends. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions later on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carol. That was very well packed. You exceeded the time by 5 minutes, but that's fine.
Sorry, I had my presentation in front of you. I did not see you, so I did not see the slide. Apologies about that. That's the risk of these webinars.
That's fine. That's okay. All right. I don't know if we have any questions. I do have one here.
So this is the polling question, sir.
Okay, great. So the question, Carol, it says, what oil price level do you expect to see? That's year to by end of year 2020. What, in other words, what do you think will be a most likely price for this year?
No, sorry, sir. This is a polling question for the audience. Sorry, Carol, it's not.
Oh, this is for the audience.
For the audience, I beg your pardon.
Ooh, okay.
I think everyone can start voting. Panelists don't, I don't think panelists can vote, but the audience can. So please go ahead and vote. Where do you see the oil prices by the end?
Yeah, basically, what's the forecast for this year? What's a reasonable forecast of oil prices for 2020? So let me just do a quick summary of what I heard from Dr. Carol. It says Nigeria still has potentially very huge oil and gas resources. Basically, if you look at our current fiscal arrangement, it does not quite check the box for what you will expect from a best-in-class fiscal regime. So she took time to go through all the criteria that she will use to assess that, and basically say, well, our current arrangement is much too complicated. It's not as simple as you want. So it doesn't meet that standard for simplicity, progressivity, and all. So she went through. And she says, well, the other thing to remember is that we have other issues. It's a maturing basin and all. So basically the balance of power is tilting more towards the investor than to government. So in designing a new fiscal arrangement, you need to have all of these factors in mind. So you will first have to build a system that checks the boxes in terms of simplicity, progressivity, and competitiveness. And then, of course, it's got to be one that necessarily recognizes the unique position that we're in. Government revenues are down, so they need to get more money. Our basins are maturing. Even the established basins, maturing means aging. So there significant investments are required to just maintain your base production. So all of these have to come into what you come up with as a new fiscal arrangement. So while this polling is still going on, I'm just trying to.
It's done now, sir. So those are the results. 42% $40, 38% think 50.
Okay, Carol, that's the result. My question to you is, what are your thoughts here?
Actually, I'm pleased to see these results because it kind of fit my own thinking as well and perception when I look at the market fundamentals. And as you can see, it kind of reflects also the general sentiment in the market, because when you read the media, sometimes the headlines, people talk about rally or collapse or decline, but really we're talking about very small changes in oil prices. And we've been stuck in this $40 range despite the massive cuts from OPEC plus. And I really don't see the situation changing drastically before the end of the year, because one thing to remember, it's not the oil market which is in the driver's seat. It's not the oil producers who are in the driver's seat. It is the global economy, which is actually at the mercy of COVID-19. So if you remember this chain, that COVID-19 is driving the economy is driving oil demand, and oil demand is driving oil markets and oil prices, then you will have a good understanding of why this kind of polling results does not surprise us. And you can see how at the beginning of the year in April, many people expected a V-shaped recovery, which means that we would go back to a normal situation, the same economic growth quite rapidly from this summer onwards. But as the numbers started to come in gradually and people realize the severity of the crisis caused by COVID-19, the recovery has been pushed for later. Some people talk about the end of 2021. So really the situation today is not terribly encouraging for investment, but I can also see an opportunity for host governments to seize on today, and that is to revisit their fiscal terms if needed, as is the case in Nigeria, and create an attractive investment environment to bring in and lock in the increasingly scarce capital for the next few years. So it's not all doom and gloom. I'm usually an optimist, so I like to see always a positive side in each story. Even investors, because we're going to see cost deflation in the coming months, then there could be an opportunity if the right synergy is created between what investors are looking for and what governments are looking for. But it takes a wise government to do that.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much, Doctor. Our next speaker is somebody that's very well known to us. We call him the professor himself, Professor Wumi Iledare. He's got a lifetime of experience in industry, more than 40 years, and basically across the lines, both academia and the professional sectors. He currently serves as Ghana GMPC Chair in Oil and Gas Studies at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. He's an Emeritus Professor of Petroleum Economics at LSU, Energy Studies USA, Director of, he's actually the current serving SPE Regional Director for Africa. He is the Chirota and Emmanuel Eboga Distinguished Professor and former Director of Emerald Energy Institute at the University of Port Harcourt, Nigeria. That was for 6 years. He is an expert in international petroleum and fiscal system economics, geopolitics of oil and gas resources and supply, and upstream petroleum economics. He was a BS, MS, and PhD in mineral resource economics from West Virginia University, 1990. He's served in very many roles, advising both the National Assembly, both the executive and legislative arm over time. And he has been the international president of the National Association of Energy Economists. So please, let's welcome Professor Wumi Iledare.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. I want to commend the Energy Institute for what they are doing, and also would like to really commend Foster for the advocacy role to make sure that we get the best out of our oil and gas resources. Let me commend Carol for beautiful presentation as well. I enjoyed it. And I sincerely shared some of our perspective with respect to simple, neutral, flexible, and rewarding type of fiscal regime. And what I'm going to do is to bring a cultural context to some of the things she had presented without necessarily contradicting, because she spoke from a professional point of view. And so what I'm going to do is try to ask a simple question. How can we balance geologic prospectivity with progressive, flexible, and stable fiscal regime? Next slide, please. And what I'd like to do is to see if I can facilitate a good understanding of the general fiscal element of fiscal regimes and economic rent mechanism. And again, my objective is what I call mutuality of interest between the stakeholders, the investors, and the community. Next slide, please. This picture will give you a perspective that we are not running out of oil, but we're actually running into it. But they are drivers. And what are these drivers? And that's what we call the key elements of fiscal regime. Next slide, please. There are three things you need to put into consideration when designing a fiscal system. And they are not mutually exclusive. They are contemporaneous. They are related: economics, technology, and public policy. These are very critical if you are going to be able to develop your petroleum resources and reserves to make sustainable development. And I want to emphasize the importance of research and development. There must be an interplay between the university, the government, and the industry. And to me, this is what of the important missing link when you look at fiscal system design with respect to sustainable development in a petroleum resource endowed nation. Now, this is where the role of government comes in, and that's the essence of our being here. Next slide, please. Next slide. Again, we don't want to go to the past. You have yesterday, you have today, and you have tomorrow. Today is when you have to do what you need to do to make tomorrow quite rewarding. But you can always learn from yesterday. We have not done well when it comes to developing the fiscal system for sustainable economic growth. What we have done, in my opinion, and I've been a participant of this business for quite a long time, so I can speak to it. So basically, this is an opportunity for us to use this fiscal regime so as to be able to drive this reform to a concluding end, whereby we will be able to add value to the economy. When you have an economy that is driven by oil, but contributing less than 10% to the GDP, then something is wrong with the way we emphasize the development of our resources. And that's why I think that this reform is inevitable. And this is the time to do it. Because tomorrow will come again, and that will be another year. Next slide, please. Basically, then when you are designing a fiscal regime, you need to look at the objective of the government, which basically to use petroleum to benefit its citizens, and then use that leverage to get to develop your national capacity. And capacity not in terms of just training young and emerging professionals, but capacity in terms of leveraging on the excitement in your people to participate in the industry. So you develop policies that will limit the barrier to entry and trying to do whatever it is to make assets of the oil and gas business bankable to indigenous firms without necessarily closing your door for international flow. Next slide, please. So basically then you must pay attention to the investor's objective. If you go back to the global petroleum resource distribution, there are so many places that you need to go and look for oil and gas. And the investors are actually looking at what they are going to gain from their investment, both in the short run and in the long run. And like my chair will always say, optics matter. And therefore, the first thing they look at when they've seen that you have a great geological endowment is the fiscal system that is going to enhance the development of it. So the key determinants for flow of investment is how competitive your fiscal regimes are and how attractive they are and how stable they are. Next slide, please. So basically then, when you look at fiscal system, it's a collective of instructions and elements that guarantee reward that is in accordance to risk and at the same time give government access to revenue. So the host government is really the driver. And when they shirk in their responsibilities, that's when you see them blaming international investors or even local participants that they are the one making it impossible for them to reform the industry. So in my opinion, this is the time. This is the time for government to take the responsibility and really present a stable fiscal and flexible fiscal system. Next slide, please. So basically it's about rent extraction mechanism when you develop a fiscal system. And there are two broad categories. You have what they call concessionary and contractual. The only difference is the ownership and the mechanics of calculating the economic rent. Nigeria operates both concessionary. Next slide, please. So what we did is to look at selected countries, following Carol's advice and being conscious of the level of development of each of the country. And so you see that if you look at all the countries that we look at in America, in Africa, in Europe, and in Middle East, concessionary systems seems to be the most adopted. And basically the government give a concession, they take royalty and they pay taxes. And then the government can opt to be a joint venture. Nigeria operates both. Next slide, please. Next slide. Well, also we also look at, I don't know, am I on? Can you hear me, Joe?
I can hear you.
Okay. All right. Okay, then you then look at, okay, how does the government combine all of these to be able to develop a fiscal system that is stable and workable? And that's why the idea of combination of instrument comes in. You have royalty, you have taxes, and you have incentives. And these are very critical in order to be able to accomplish some of the things that needed to be accomplished. Again, also you have two aspects to fiscal regime. One is operational, and the other one is revenue related and production sharing. And then quite often you then decide whether you pass a law or you do it by negotiation. Now, Carol mentioned about fiscal system design, and this is very important. And this thing needs to be looked at contextually. Basically, it's not common to fix your instrument anymore. So you can either have what they call a fiscal, that makes it impossible for you to be able to capture the downtime and the uptime. And so the tendency is to look at your instrument and make sure that they are progressive. In that case, they call it sliding scale type of royalty, whereby now you are able to tie it to production, or you tie it to economics. I know Carol mentioned the fact that if you don't tie your instrument to profitability measures, then you cannot talk about progressivity. But at least you can reduce the regressive nature of some of those instruments, even though you don't get full progressivity. And that's why, to me, and what is common, and we try to look at it, next slide, please. We try to see in the next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, right, stop there. Back a little bit. Yes, we'll try to see in all these countries that we looked at, what do they tie their royalty to? Royalty is more or less like paying an homage. And say, okay, you have given me your resources. This is what I'm going to give to you in return for extracting your resources. But fixing it will not be palatable in the sense that the smaller size endowment will not be produced. So we discovered that looking at some of these countries, they either tie to production, tie to oil and gas price, or tie to well productivity. For Nigeria, it's currently tied to terrain. And so we believe that even though it may not give you full progressivity, but it makes the system flexible depending on how the price of oil is behaving, the size of discovery, and the terrain where you are operating. Next slide, please. We also try to look at the design in different countries in terms of progressive, fixed, and where there's no royalty. Right now, we will say by our definition, maybe instead of saying progressive, we use flexible. 32% are tied to something to make sure that it self-adjusts. And only 16% of all the royalty we examine are without royalty. So basically then you find out that about 84% of the fiscal regime we examined have one form of royalty on the other. Again, next slide, please. And so we look at different countries to be able to compare Nigeria to them. Next country, next slide. So because my time is so, and then we see now when it comes to taxation, because you can classify rent extraction mechanism into about three: pre-discovery, post-discovery, and profit declare. And we discovered that 76% of the 17 countries we examined has what we call a single tax system. From the central government point of view, because you have other taxes that can be state, can be crypto, can be over. Then when it comes to paying the central government, they usually have what we call corporate income tax. Next slide, please. And so we decided to look at the countries and see the corporate tax rate and use it to be able to determine which of this fiscal system is actually performing better than that of Nigeria that we have right now. Quickly, please, next slide. Next slide. And then, of course, again, I told you, whenever you are designing a fiscal system, there are three things to pay attention to. One, royalty. Two, tax. Three, incentives. And the combination of these three will determine the reward you give to the investors and the access that is granted to the owner of the resources with respect to the revenue generated. Next slide, please. Again, this presentation we made available, you will see that all of the systems that we examined, even though they don't have the same reserve size, they are able to incorporate these three instruments to be able to make sure that there's adequate reward and there's adequate access. Next slide, please. The same thing, these are some of the countries that we examined to be able to evaluate the current state of things and why we think the reform that we have been trying to pursue since 2000 is due, and is due actually today. Again, you have royalty, you have capital allowance, you have incentives, and then you have taxes. The design must have a combination of all of these aspects that we optimize the reward to the investors and the benefit to the government. How you accomplish this is what Carol referred to in terms of complexity and simplicity. And I want to bring this particular point to us. We must always look at the cultural context that we have with respect to the way we design our fiscal system. We are interested in investment. Some other countries, even though they are interested, they are not as pressured as we are because the investment comes from their environment. So we must be careful not to just take what is dictated to us because it may not fit us well. Next slide, please. Again, like I mentioned, contractual is different from concessionary. I think asking somebody who is your contractor to pay royalty and penalize him to pay royalty is something we need to revisit, because royalty and profit oil or profit gas, they can accomplish the same thing. So I will continue to plead with our designers. Let us bring our mind together, debate this issue, evaluate them, because it's not about now. Remember, Petroleum Act was enacted in 1969, and we're still using it today. So this is the time for us to bury all our egos, bring the best mind together so that we can accomplish something tangible for generations to come. And that's where flexibility, simplicity, and operability is very, very important. Let's move quickly so that I can round up for questions. How do I then compare all of these fiscal systems that I reviewed? And so what we decide to do is to look at it. You have your revenue, then you take your royalty, Then you look at your non-capital cost. Then you give your capital allowance. Then if you have incentive based on effort or output, you deduct it. And then you have taxable income, you have special petroleum tax, and then of course you have investors' profit. The bigger the yellow as perceived, the more likelihood is to get investment. And that's why some of us were thinking that maybe expanding output may be something we want to put into consideration. Because I believe, and I think I'm not wrong, that if we're able to expand our output for the economy, we are going to be less dependent on the profit from oil. Because government will be able to generate a lot of taxes. So if you can think of using oil as an input of production and focus more on non-oil revenue for government expansion and its activity, the better. So finally, let's look at what did we get. So we take an assumption. We look at a deep water project in Nigeria. We look at the cost profile and we assume the production profile. Next slide. And then we characterize it, next please, with certain economic assumption, and we compare to access to government revenue. Pay attention to this. The first three are some of the efforts Nigeria has taken to reform the industry. And you could see basically if you look at the average for all these 10 or so countries that we examine, look at Brazil. They are the one with the highest access to revenue, but they don't get a lot of taxes. But they are operating a completely different system called production sharing contract. Look at our own production sharing contract, Nigerian production sharing contract. In terms of access to government revenue, the petroleum industry fiscal bill of 2018 gives a lot and is depending more on taxes than royalty. Listen, you may think that the PIFB is industry friendly because royalty is not contributing as much. But this shows that the government is interested towards the end of the profit before taking their own share. And that's probably going to be the new way of thinking if your fiscal system is supposed to expand the output and sustain the oil and gas industry. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we compare other results. The slides will be made available to you. The fact that you have access to revenue is high does not necessarily mean it's going to translate to a lot of money. And that is the key. Government take may be high, but the access to revenue is different. So you have to look at some of these things and be able to make a good judgment. I want you to look at the slide to the right, which is when you look at the project economics, then you look at the contractor internal rate of return. Again, you will see that the fiscal system that we examine in Nigeria are right in the bottom when you even look at project economics. And these are things that the companies are looking at before they bring their investment, because it's more or less a productivity type, profitability type of decision making. When you look at a company like my old company, they have businesses all over the world. The managing directors they will meet, they have limited investment fund, and what they do is to run the project for a particular period of time. And the one with the highest profitability index is the one they will go to. And so the government, who is actually the driver of fiscal system, must put this in mind. Next slide, please. Again, these are just to let you see the different components of access to gross revenue. You will see the blue is constant because we impose the same cost profile and just see what the fiscal system will deliver. Please let me go to conclusion, please. So just let you see my recommendation based on our studies. Again, we have some pictures we can show you. We don't have enough time. But personally, I think the government must look at their royalty. And even if they are going to base it on terrain, let it be flexible. And the flexibility, and I agree with Caro, must not be complex. Don't start and have different 10 or 5 tranches. Find an economic classification of your tranches to make sure that even one tranche may go for a long time. And if for any unseen circumstances, another tranche imposed, even if it's temporary, the system will adjust itself. You won't have to go and pass a legislation. Well, you know, when Paul writes in the scripture, he will always say that this is what God says, this is what I'm saying. I personally am of the opinion that we need to separate petroleum tax from corporate income tax. We need to separate petroleum income tax. I mean, we need to separate corporate income tax from, special petroleum tax from corporate income tax, and we should examine that. We should not be bullied into saying that, oh, that's dual taxes. No, that's not dual taxes. We'll be able to tie incentives to resource development without touching the SITA. Because I foresee the future where SITA will contribute more money than petroleum tax if we build our economy with our resources. So my recommendation is for us to come to conclusion and do these things as quickly as possible. And I'm sure that the future is bright for Nigeria. With 40 million and we are producing 2.5, we have the capability of producing at least 10 million barrels per day if our economy picks up. The population of the US is only 300 million or 340 million. Our population is 200 plus million. We have 40 billion barrels. They don't have 40 billion barrels and they are producing 12.5 million per day. So there's nothing that says we cannot produce 7.5 million if we have a fiscal system that make investment attractive. Let me conclude. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'll be available for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. I knew I wasn't going to get you off in 10 minutes, but that's fine. I showed my face and I sense you saw me. So thank you very much. That was a very, very insightful presentation. I think at this point, we'll just do a quick poll. People have heard something. It's just, okay, the poll has actually started. And while we are at that, there are a couple of questions came in, and what I propose is that we leave the questions for now, and let's get comments from the other panelists. And when we are done, then we'll go into a proper Q&A, and all the questions will be answered. So at this point, I would like to quickly introduce one of our panelists who has braved all us to join us this afternoon. I call him the Geo, for those who know. His name is Mr. Ogunje Milusi from FIRS. A quick rundown, just to introduce him. Mr. Gabriel Olajide Ogunje Milusi is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Accountants of Nigeria, and associate member of the Chartered Institute of Taxation of Nigeria. He holds an MBA degree, lots of experience in tax administration spanning more than 2 decades, and 15 of that has been in oil and gas taxation. He has attended several training workshops and seminars in and outside the country. He is presently with the FIRS and he's the Director, Large Taxpayers Department, Oil and Gas of the FIRS. So as the Geo joins us, we'll just give him max 5 minutes to just share his thoughts. It's important that those of them across the fence, I mean, we are talking from the industry perspective, but there has to be a handshake between the industry, the government, and the host community. We've always talked about inclusive growth. So if the industry is going to grow in a sustainable manner, all 3 principal participants, stakeholders must be engaged in that handshake. So it's nice to have Mr. Ogunje Milusi, the Geo himself. Thank you very much for joining us, sir.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me acknowledge the first and the second presenters. They have really spoken well, and I would say that they are very vast in the subject of our discussion today. From this end, I don't know if I have a small slide, but I don't think I can share it here. But let me try if I can share it. Just a moment. Okay. I'm disabled to share, so maybe I can
I think you can talk through it. We'll appreciate that.
Thank you very much. So we just, first of all, I look at the overview of I don't need to bother myself, the fiscal policies and fiscal regime overview. I also, but let me, in order to belabor the point too much, let me speak to the areas that I think I talk of comparability. We all know this, the regime that we're having in Nigeria, which the initial earlier speakers have spoken on. But the rate of tax in Nigeria, we know as high as it is about 85. For deep offshore, is 50%. And we know that we have incentives that ranges from write-off of capital allowance, 100% a year they are incurred on some costs. We know that we have ACFA incentives, which allow the cost of the production of gas to be charged to oil development. And we also know that the gas is taxed at the rate of 30%. And our capital allowances we amortize over a period of 5 years. We have a capital cost of lift, which is no longer in vogue as such, but we know that we have as high as 50%, and even some tax credit of as high as 50% also. So we have other fiscal incentives that we are, which we know that are not encouraging productivity as such, but nonetheless, we know that those ones are also adding up to why we are having a high rate. On the good fiscal, our present current fiscal regime, because the competitiveness of it is the core objective of the good fiscal policy is for economic stimulation and economic growth of the nation. And internal assessment of the foreign direct investment, recount inflow relations related to oil and gas, GDP growth, and all those sorts of things to consider. In deciding an attractive fiscal policy, government must strike a balance between the core objective of to maximize its benefits in the resources exploitation and attracting investors. That is, the fiscal policy can be investor friendly without government compromising more than enough for a society wealth. Then we consider some EU that we set some parameters to align the competitiveness of our fiscal system. We have the government stake versus investor stake, investor returns on investment and incremental investment, geological risk, and some physical neutrality and stability. When we look at compatibility as a result to onshore, we know that we have a high rate of tax, as high as 85%, so to say, but that's just the nominal rate. We know the effective tax rate can be as low, though not yet put up, it's around 45 to 55 thereabout on the onshore. While we have the royalty rate as high as 20%, very high, we agree. On the onshore, our rate is also 50%, where we have some as high as 78%. As Norway, we have Angola as high as 65%. And we know that the royalty now at the deep offshore is just 10% flat rate, which we still consider that is very high. We also consider the tabular analysis of fiscal incentive, which we believe that make our rate to look as high when we compare with other jurisdictions. And we look at other incentives, we say 100% expense of some capital to be written off in the year they are in prayer. We took Brazil, Norway, Ghana, and Angola as a sample. It's applicable in Nigeria. We can't see it in the other ones we considered. Cost uplift to up to 50% in deep offshore. You know that's applicable 50%, that's Nigeria 50%, Brazil is only 34%, Norway 22%, Ghana 35%. Angola is 30 to 40% subject to the block profitability. Tax credit in Nigeria, on the deep offshore, we have as high as 50% ITC. We cannot see it in other jurisdictions where we compared. We have stamp duties in Nigeria is exempted from all the activity contract in the oil and gas industry is exempted from stamp duty in Nigeria. In Brazil, it's applicable. In Norway, it's applicable. Ghana exempted it. Then we have Angola is applicable. So ACFA, Nigeria is applicable, is not applicable in other jurisdictions we look at, and so on and so forth. We know the gas rate in Nigeria also is at 30%. We have same in Brazil, 30%. Then in Norway, same as well too. Then in Nigeria, in Angola, 35%. VAT rate in Nigeria, we know that VAT rate in Nigeria have recently just increased to 7.5%. Whereas in other jurisdictions, we have as high, in Brazil, for instance, we have as high as 20%. In Norway, we have 26%. In Ghana, 12.5%. And in Angola, between 2% to 30%. So we said, then we know that there's a lot to be done to enable our fiscal regime to comfortably compete globally. And it is hopeful that the ongoing petroleum industry bill will address majority of the shortcomings in the present fiscals. Several incentives that drive down the effective tax rate must be clearly stated, and investors should be carried along in the event of any fiscal changes due to long-term investment forecast. Some of these inherent fiscal incentives in Nigeria include the deductibility of royalty, which we know incurred for PPT, though it's high, but it's still an allowable reduction. And that means we take back whatever we have given. In some clients like Saudi Arabia, we know royalty is not an allowable reduction. Expenses of capital costs, which I've said before, 100% the year they are incurred, we need to look at it. Cost uplift to up to 50%. We know that we are looking at production allowance now, so that it will not be based on production, not necessarily on cost. So the allowability of capital, this Act 5 of 18, we know that it's not even encouraging development of gas in the non-associated gas field. It's something that we believe that needs to be looked at, so that we can also develop development of gas in the non-associated.
Yeah. Just a reminder, I think your 5 minutes is up. If you can just wrap up.
Okay, let me say way forward, we just look at the way forward, say that the way forward remains amendment of the current legislation and structuring of the entire oil and gas industry fiscal regime as it to the globally competitive and attractive to investors. We know that that one also is very important. It needs to be attractive for us to even be able to bring the oil out. Resource exploitation are not forever, and reserves deplete, and demand of the resources might be overtaken by technology and other innovation like green energy and so on and so forth. This is our understanding that the petroleum industry bill will address majority of the anomalies in the fiscal in this rule. We know that government is open to constructive criticism, and also if there are recommendations, government is really to listen and to adapt. So that I can stop there, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ogajio. That's so packed. There's so much you didn't say. There's so much you said, and there's so much you didn't say. So I'm sure that we'll get a bit more insight when the questions start rolling out. We are pressed for time, so I'm going to invite our madam from the Ministry of Finance. Sadly, I don't have a full profile before me, but she will just quickly introduce herself. Madam, you have just 5 minutes to give us insight into the thinking from your side of the divide, and that will help us. Eventually, we'll all come to a common position. Madam, please. Hajia Fatima, welcome.
Yes,
thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? Good afternoon.
Yes, we can hear you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I'm Fatima Hayatu. I'm the Director of Technical Services in the Federal Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning. I'm in charge of the tax policy and the oil and gas department division. They are all under my purview. So I'll just start by saying that government has put in place presently a lot of incentives to make the oil and gas industry attractive in the country. We have about 3 main incentives that the ministry is currently pursuing. We have the gas utilization downstream operation that is under the section 39 of the Companies Income Act. These are waivers that are given just to make investment friendly, to attract foreign direct investment in the sector. The government also uses we give waivers for utilization of the associated gas, whereby we write off most of the waivers for anybody is bringing in equipment and materials. We waive the duty and some part of the taxes, just to make it attractive for investment. My colleague has dwelled so much on the tax base, and I don't want, and since the time is limited, I'll just go ahead to say, how much government has conceded just to make it attractive for investment and to give you the figures of what we've had so far between 2017 and 2019 as direct government investment. And then to give you what the government has also considered in terms of taxes and duty waivers, just to make it attractive. And of course, we know that recently government also launched the AKT just to encourage gas production in the country. And because of that, government gave out a sovereign guarantee to the investments. This is just like encouraging people to come and invest in in the sector. So I'll give the figures. Then just appreciate what the two speakers said. Sorry, I should have started with that, but I'm trying to run with time. What you've said, just as Mr. Ogunjemilusi said, government is open to criticisms, but constructive one. We've heard what he said, and I think we will look at that and then try to see what can be done to make it attractive and then as simple as possible, especially the taxes. We are trying to diversify it, so that we will not just rely heavily on oil. We are looking into the other non-oil sectors. I know that government has also done a lot to encourage people to go into mining and agriculture. So I'll just, for now, just tell you that government has, from 2017 to 2019, we've had that's from records, and these are verifiable records. We've had about 211 billion, 390 million, 80,000 naira. That is indirect investment. And out of that, government conceded about 10 billion, 822 million, 260,000 naira. So I think with that, the government and the ministry is trying all it can to encourage people to come and invest in the sector. And we know that, yes, most of the taxes and the laws are overdue for an overhaul. And with the new finance bill, we intend that every year get stakeholders to come and discuss and see how some of these reforms can be tailored into the Finance Act of each year, just to make it attractive and then as simple as possible, so that government can meet up its own commitment to the citizens.
Thank you very much, Hajia Hayatu.
Yes.
We really appreciate your contribution.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've heard from the panelists. At this point, we will go on to look at some of the questions that has been raised. A few questions came through, so I will just quickly direct them to. The first one says, what effect would energy transition have on Nigeria's ability to maximize government take? I would love Carol to take a stab at this.
It's a big question, but it's interesting. And I'm sure that many governments should be thinking about it, because the energy transition is happening, it is real, and more governments around the world are getting more and more aggressive. So you may be sitting in Nigeria thinking much about it, but if you sit in Europe or elsewhere, you can see how seriously this is being taken. Now, when it comes to energy transition, how do we translate that to understand the impact on government take and government revenues? Really, energy transition means you're moving away from fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal towards a greener future. And this means that the demand for these fuels, particularly, for example, like we focus on oil for now, is going to peak and then starts to decline. It may decline fast, may decline gradually, we don't know. But exactly actually what we have today with COVID-19 has given us a taste of how the market condition will look like once demand peaks and starts to fall. And when you have a shrinking market, so a fall in oil demand will result in a shrinking market, then what happens, prices also come down. And typically the low-cost producer is the last to leave the market. So the high-cost producer is the first to leave because they cannot sustain low prices, and the one who stays in the market is the low-cost producer. And here where I am concerned about Nigeria, because Nigeria is not a low-cost producer. Saudi Arabia is, the UAE is, Kuwait is, but Nigeria is a high-cost producer. So if I look at it only under existing conditions, if nothing else changes, I don't think the energy transition is going to bring good news to Nigeria. Compared to other producers, I think Nigeria will be worse off because they will be among the first to leave the market. What does that mean? Also, it means that they will be left with stranded assets, resources that they could have developed today or in the next few years and produce and generate revenues. They are going to be left untouched because investors are not going to commit. Because mind you, when investors put money in these conventional resources, they are thinking about the next at least 20 years, 30 years down the line. And if they don't think they can get much value, or they have to wait for too long to get their to recover their costs, then they would look elsewhere. So if things don't change, the energy transition will be simply less revenues for the government, less investment, unless the government takes a step and try to compensate for this perception of high cost of production and use the fiscal regime to counterweigh the lack of attractiveness in terms of cost of production. I could go on, but I'm aware of time, so let me leave it here, and I hope I conveyed perhaps some of the aspects for the question.
Thank you. That was very direct. Okay. There's another question here. I think this was specific to Prof. It said, Prof, what do we benefit from OPEC membership when their production caps adversely affect revenues in these critical times? Prof, please. Did we lose him? Is he still on? Prof, are you there?
I think it's,
okay.
It's muted. So.
He's muted. Yeah, but he should hear us. All right. Well, I'll keep that for him. There was another question, and I think I'll send this to the General Overseer himself. Ogadio, what in your view should be Nigerians' oil and gas fiscal stance? In other words, how does Nigeria position given our resource endowment and the imminent energy transition? How do you think Nigeria should position itself?
In terms of, can you come again?
Fiscally, what should be our position in a fiscal sense, given that we do have significant oil and gas resources untapped, and yes, the energy transition is here with us. So clearly, the demand for oil and gas will, over time, turn down. Yes. So what do you think our position as a nation should be?
I think as a nation, in fact, when you look at what we are trying to come up with at this PIFB now, it's already looking into that, and it's part of what has been factored in a bit. Because we know that very soon, oil may no longer be relevant as it is. And if we have the oil locked down on the ground, untapped, then it's just like wasting assets after some time. So government is quite aware of this, and we are already looking at how through the fiscal to make it attractive. And yes, we can say it's not a perfect document yet, but it's a still work in progress. And a lot of development has actually happened. I mean, we have, I think I know too, we have engaged some the oil producers, the IOC and the IPPs, even in the course of the development of this PIV now. And it's still work in progress. And we are looking at that. I believe by the time that we come out with it, it will be something that will be a little bit more attractive, because we are looking at how we can allow the undeveloped field to be released to investors that are willing to develop them. So, and most of those things have already factored in the PIB and the PIB. So I believe hopefully there's going to be a lot of things that will change going forward. Okay, thank you, sir. I think that's basically what I hear you say is that we need to position for competitiveness. We need to be in a position where we will be able to attract the much needed investment in short order, so that we don't leave these oil and gas resources stranded ultimately. So that's well taken. The next question will go to Hajia Hayatu. Says some people, and indeed I've had this from a lot of people, that believe that the oil era is over. I agree with that, but they equally go further to say that Nigeria need not worry
that we should just focus on extracting maximum value from whatever investments we've made. In other words, this whole idea of chasing investment does not cut it with a reasonable, number of our people, especially on the policy side. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think we are at that point where we'll just raise our hands and say, well, no need investing more, given that one, we can produce above OPEC quotas, two, our cost is so high that the margin have continued to thin out. So why invest more? I've had this from people. So the question is, what do you really think about this?
Yes, just like Carol said, oil and gas will continue to be relevant because it's part of human activity. I don't want us, I will not advise the government to just walk away. We should find a way of reducing the cost of production, but we have to strike a balance, and then we need to get our acts together to that terms of security, to make the region safer for investors to come in. So I don't think walking away will not, it's not a problem, because we have oil and gas will continue to be relevant. There will be demand for it. So we just need to get our acts together and put the PIB in order to make it attractive. So it's not wise to say we should walk away from it. Oil will continue to be relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if Prof is back now. I can see him. Prof,
Yes.
You've got a long list of questions waiting for you.
Okay.
One of them is, will the passage of the PIB be sufficient in solving most of the fiscal problems, discouraging investment into Nigerian oil and gas industry? Okay, so that's very specific. And the other question I had asked earlier of you was on OPEC. The question was whether Nigeria should continue to belong to OPEC, given that if we grew volume, OPEC caps will make sure we don't produce them, right? So the question is, are we at that point where we need to take a second look at our membership of OPEC?
Thank you very much, and I apologize. I have 3 sources of internet, and I have to be shuttling to find one that is stable. Let me quickly just say, with respect to PIB, passing the PIB will not necessarily solve our problems, because, like I said, governance itself may not be included in the PIB. So, like perception is so important with respect to where investment goes. We used to be ranked the most frequent, most happy person in the world. That is not the case. Security of assets will not be guaranteed with PIB. But at least it's one thing that we can have going for us. You and I, we know very well. I was fortunate to work in the Niger Delta in my younger age. And I used to give an example, riding on a Sunday afternoon on Okobo River without any escort. How can we go back to that type of day? It depends on the governance experience that we have. Passing the PIB, we just remove the uncertainty cloud that we have right now. And we almost succeeded in 2018 when the world was thinking that we are going to pass the governance bill. So let us just forget about different ego and put the nation as the focus and pass the bill. And then use the petroleum money effectively. And some of those insecurity that we have, we win away. Now, with respect to OPEC, I think Nigerians should consider themselves blessed, if I can use the word, that we are in OPEC. And OPEC needs us as much as we need them. So the focus should not just be about Nigeria in the OPEC membership. The focus should be about the role of OPEC with stability of the world oil market. Secondly, if you look at Nigeria, we do not have any research, policy, information gathering mechanism compared to other OPEC countries. We don't have any institute that does a policy analysis as to where the oil market is going. OPEC is not about sharing oil or allocating. No, OPEC is about coordinating the policy framework for countries that are members. I remember in 2002, and I'll keep quiet quickly, I was invited to speak in Nigeria as to whether we should be a member of OPEC or not. I think you were there. Listen, even our condensate production is not part of our quota. What we need to do is to find a way to expand our capacity, and our production quota will go up. We have stayed on 2.5 million barrels capacity, and that's what our location is. If we move out of OPEC and the market is flooded, we can't even coordinate. So I still suggest we be an OPEC for conservation point of view, so that this current governance structure that we have will not take all our oil, and the children coming in the future will disappear. We have not used the money we got from the oil that we have produced, and we just want to flood the market, produce all the oil, and our energy security will be in question in the future. OPEC is helping us, in my opinion, to have good understanding of the market dynamics and apply it well. Thank you. On mute.
Ooh, sorry about that. Sorry, and thank you for your answers. I think you basically addressed the concerns that was being expressed. So the question really then is, if you stay in OPEC with the quota restrictions, you need to do something with the capacity, your additional capacity you hope to bring on with the investment level, you know. So that takes us to the issue of domestic consumption, whether you call it diversification of the oil and gas domestically. A lot of issues, practically everybody I know who has been involved in this is one thing we've grappled with. There has been a lot of incentives in the midstream that has not translated to investment. My question is, are there specific things that we need to put in the PIB going forward that will help us to diversify the Nigerian oil and gas sector, essentially along the value chain? I will throw this question to you, Prof. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Can you all hear me?
We can hear you, so I can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, Carol, do you want to speak on that? Specifically, are there things we should put in our new fiscal regulation to enable midstream and downstream diversification? So basically, if we stay in OPEC, we're going to build capacity, we won't be able to export it. We need to refine it locally, right? And do other stuff with it. So how do we enable that with fiscal rules?
Wow, fiscal rules. I mean, here we're heading into towards macroeconomic issues. But you see, the issue of economic diversification is much bigger than just the oil sector. It has to do also with how you manage the oil revenue. So here we focus the discussion today largely on what is going on with Nigeria. And I find it more valuable also to look also what's happening in the broader picture. But also we focused on the design of the fiscal regime, on what are the structural weaknesses and how can this be addressed, looking at the principles. So it was very micro discussion. But then but it's like one pillar of a bridge. I always like to use the metaphor of a bridge, like you're building a bridge and you need several legs to build a bridge. And the design of the fiscal regime is one pillar of that bridge. But you also need other pillars to ensure that if you design the perfect regime, that will have a positive spillover for the rest of the economy. And this is where the revenue management come to the picture. And again, you see, I don't like to be somebody who's criticizing. I look at the numbers. I'm an economist. I look at the data. I look at the studies, and I don't think Nigeria has done pretty well in terms of revenue management. And there is a lot they can do to improve that aspect. And you can use the revenue management strategy to diversify your economy. You revisit your macroeconomics policies and to diversify other sectors, so you reduce your dependence on oil revenues and the economic's vulnerability to oil prices. I mean, it's amazing that Nigeria is an important producer, the 6th largest producer within OPEC, and you know you've been producing for decades now, and yet when I look at the economic indicators, they don't speak well. You need $130 a barrel oil price to balance the budget. So this is something not going well when it comes to revenue management and diversification of the economy. But we don't have time to really discuss the macro aspect of fiscal rules. Fiscal rules have their positive and their negatives. It's not really something that will lead to solutions. They could be part of the solution, but it's not that if you have a fiscal rule, then you're going to have a good macro policy. Some countries do well without fiscal rules. Others do have fiscal rules, but they break them. So the answer is not clear cut, like yes, have them and it will be the solution.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I think that's very insightful. The next question really is, this will go to Ogajio from FIRS. Why don't you comply with DPR mandated tax rates? For instance, marginal field PPT rates per DPR is 55%, but FIRS insists on collecting 85%, which is the normal rate for normal fields. So that's one question. I think the next question will be for Gio as well, is do you think that the passage of the PI will be sufficient in solving most of our fiscal problems that has held down investment over time? So, Ogajio.
Okay, thank you, sir. Let me start from the one that the last question. It is hoped that it will solve most of the problem, but it cannot solve all. We know that. Yeah. Where the prof has mentioned some. We're talking of security is part of it. No matter how your fiscal system is attractive, if you don't have good security system, it may not even still attract any investor. So that one it will try as far as it's concerned on fiscal, we try to solve as many as possible, but you can't get a perfect fiscal system at once. It's over time. But we'll make sure that it's not what it used to be. It's going to be something that is very, that going forward is going to be very simple and also attractive. And we also discourage, I keep saying that we need to discourage also this issue of cost element in the production in Nigeria. We know that the cost is a major challenge. And if we now change to production allowance, we know that this cost piling of a thing may no longer be there as it used to be. So hopefully it's going to resolve as many things as possible. So the first question, the DPR has no power in the law to fix the rate of tax. The rate, fixing tax rate is only a function of the National Assembly. So the one that is in the law is the one that FRS is allowing, but the one that is fixed by DPR, which I don't know, I don't think DPR can fix any rate for tax anyway. So it's unlike royalty there. Royalty used to be a regulation which is done by the Ministry of Petroleum Resources. So tax rate is is prerogative power of the National Assembly. So that's why FRS insists on the one that is legislated and not the one that is given by side letters. Thank you very much.
Okay, and the second one? Oh, okay, you've answered both actually. Great. Next question.
So please, let me quickly just comment on the question you asked me that I didn't answer. Just 1 minute with respect to what can we do. And I think, to me, especially with investment flow to downstream, we need to decouple upstream investment from downstream investment. And that's why I'm an advocate that we should have a resource tax that is different from corporate investment tax. Right now, you have the downstream of the oil and gas sector and the gas. They pay CETA, but quite often they deduct their cost from the more expensive tax. But if we have a resource tax and we have a CITA, corporate income tax, upstream we pay their resource tax. If they are involved in the downstream component, then they will pay CITA and all the taxes will be deducted from that aspect. To me, I think we spend too much money to subsidize the downstream from using upstream oil and gas revenue. And that, to some extent, is not allowing the downstream to stand up on its own. And that's where I think the fiscal system could be in such a way that there is a consistency and cross-subsidization will be minimized. And you can even incentivize when you want the resource to be expanded, you can.
So, there are no more questions.
Tax holiday, and so on and so forth. And that's why we need to do due diligence with the fiscal system that we are designing now for enhancement of the industry along the value chain, including the midstream as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Okay, I think we've come to this point. Does anybody have any other questions they would like to ask before we proceed? Okay, so there's none. So at this point, I think we're just gonna wrap up. We've been sitting here for almost getting to 2 hours. So it's been an interesting discourse for me. I've learned quite a few things here today. I had a few questions of mine, but I think I will just let that go. I will reach Prof privately, and he can try to sort me out. Okay. I'll give each person a 2-minute slot to just share some closing thoughts on what you think going forward we should be doing, and if there are specific takeaways you think we will benefit from, please share those. So I will start with Hajia. Your closing thoughts, madam.
Hello, good evening, everybody. This has been a very eye-opening and interactive forum. I personally have benefited, and we've taken all the discussions, and I hope we'll have the papers at the end of the meeting so that it can inform future decisions and policy making. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hajia, and we are really, really honored to have you today. I will go to, so that I'm not accused of gender insensitivity, I will ask I will ask the professor himself to please share his closing thoughts. Prof, it seems you're muted. We can't hear you.
I've seen it.
Okay, great.
We need to look at our royalty. Currently, is among the highest. 15%, 20% is too high. We need to think in terms of that. Second, we need to not allow access to gross revenue to drive our fiscal system. And I understand, because we have not managed the money well. If we want more money, let us have a petroleum revenue management strategy. Third, our current tax rate does not encourage savings, because we are saying that if I save $1 offshore, then 50% of it will go to the government. We need to look at that. And if I save $1 onshore, then 85% will go to government. We need to think about that. Finally, let me say that the future is bright. Nigeria is one of the most prolific petroleum basins in the world. And the expansion to even other basins that we have not explored are potentially lucrative. We must manage the optics very well.
Yep.
we must manage the optics very well. One of the vital components to promote competitiveness and attractiveness is fiscal regime, but strong institution. The separation of commercial from policy and regulatory is very critical for any fiscal reform to function. Let NMPC does commercial. Let regulatory body does regulation. And let the office of the minister does the policy. And yet they can still have interaction to make sure that they are on the same page. Your fiscal system will not deliver if you do not have a governance institution that is effective, efficient, ethical, and transparent. That's my takeaway. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Once a professor, always a professor. Okay, and at this point, I will invite the GO himself to please share his closing thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. First of all, appreciate the organizer of this program. Very good, and it's very educative and exciting. My final thought is that from the look of it, like we are not developing gas as we're supposed to, as much as we're supposed to do, not having at the back of our mind that Nigeria is more of a gas state. And gas is part of the clean energy that we know that very soon, even when the oil is going, I think the gas will still going to be very, very relevant. I think we should try to start looking at that area more now, so that in no distance, in that time, we should be able to be getting more from the gas than the oil. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay, and that's, I think I will just do a quick wrap up before I hand over to Yewande. A few thoughts, just listening to the panelists today. Clearly, from the work that has been done, it shows that we are not fiscally competitive going into this reform. So we need to have that at the back of our minds, that we need to do a bit more to come up with a system that will be fiscally competitive. Oh, yeah, I missed out. And I've been looking at, okay, great. So, Carol, please, I will yield the floor to you. I goofed. I thought you had spoken.
I was going to laugh, but because you said you're not going to be, you don't want to be accused of gender discrimination, I thought that is by itself. Well, look, I mean, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed this insightful discussion. And I would like to highlight just a few principles here. That first of all, when it comes to the fiscal regime, remember, the devil is in the details. So just comparing headline rates between country and country B will not give you a complete picture. On the contrary, it can lead to very misleading conclusions. That's why you need to really look at the nitty-gritty details of the fiscal regime, the legislation, everything has to do in that before reaching conclusion. Then it's a question of balance. Of course, no one fiscal regime was ideal. It doesn't exist in real life. It exists in theory. But you need a balance of regressive instruments and progressive instruments. So overall, the regime is more progressive than regressive. And then finally, I know that one of the comments was that Nigeria's being high cost is not news. Of course, it's not news, but what is news is that own markets have changed fundamentally, and you will be competing for the same capital with so many other countries, many of which have better fiscal arrangements than in Nigeria. So just keep in mind the bigger picture, what's happening outside Nigeria, because you're competing for the same capital. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well said. Very, very succinct and clear. So I will just do a quick this. Like I said, clearly, point number one for me is that our current fiscal arrangement is not as competitive as it should be. Just like Carol said, the world has changed, and that system is not dynamic enough to adjust to those changes. So we really need to do something about that. And in doing something about that, we need a system that is simple, not this very complicated, something that's progressive, and something that really provides sufficient enough return to the investor, the man that will bring his money to do this. And the other issues that whatever system we come up with needs to address will be the communities. You know, we tend to forget that there's the fiscal side to community agitation. So I think that whatever new system we come up with needs to address specific issues around inclusive growth in the host communities. Strengthening our license to operate is very, very important. Otherwise, going to work will be tough for most people. It needs to equally address the issue of intergenerational wealth transfer. So clearly, this generation of Nigerians should never go to bed thinking that the oil and gas resources we have belong to us and us alone. And we either save money or we build infrastructure that we will hand over to our children. I think that's equally something that the fiscal system needs to think about. The other one that is very important, it sticks out, is cost control. I think, and I believe that our current high cost environment has something to do with the fiscal system. Prof talked about savings index, right? So if you have an 85% tax rate, your savings index is very low. And I think that's part of what is, so we have a fiscal system that is fueling a high unit cost production. So a redesign of that system should always bear in mind that we need a system that essentially helps us to rein in cost. So for me, and then of course the issues of institutional reform, separating commercial from regulatory, from operating arms. So we need to make sure that there's clarity of rules, because part of what has happened here is that we've kind of modeled up everything, and it has to be, it's because of the way the industry has evolved. So it's time to actually strengthen our institutions and ensure that there's clarity in rules. So those are some of the things I think that the reform that we are embarking on should deliver. And I hear in the next couple of weeks, we might be getting a peep into what has been proposed. So it's important that we all bear this in mind as we go through this document. So at this point, I would like to thank the Energy Institute leadership for the opportunity to come, not just to come and moderate, to come and learn. I have enjoyed every second of my time here today. And maybe after this, I will join you eventually. I've been, thinking about it. So it's interesting what you guys have accomplished. So I really, really thank you. And I hope you keep this up. And I will invite you, Madam Abuse, Mrs. Abuse, right?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Joe. Thank you very much. Very well moderated. Just to let, because I saw some messages coming up saying that are these presentations available? Yes, they are available. Just send an email to einigeria@energyins.org. So we'll send them to you. Also, this session has been recorded, so it's going to be on our website. So look through our website. I'm sure you'll be able to find the link to it. Thank you to all our fantastic speakers. A special thank you to Dr. Carol, who's an alumni of University of Surrey. I think that's important to state. Yes, so now I'm just going to introduce or have Mr. Michael just say a quick vote of thanks to all our fantastic speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks once again for joining us today. Thank you from Foster. I want to appreciate Energy Institute for partnering with us on this. This is just one in the series of the dialogue, one session in the series, petroleum dialogue series that we're having. And we will continue to have this until we get a competitive fiscal regulation. And we were working on other sectors, other parts, other sections of the PIB as well. So you keep seeing our adverts or our notification. For example, on Thursday, we are going to be having another one with the industry. So you keep seeing this one in the media. So we enjoin everybody to join us as we go on that journey for us to ensure that we get the best that we can get and maximize value from the resources that God has endowed our country with. Thank you very much. We hope to see you soon.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.